First approached me about preaching, speaking to you guys today, he suggested that it might be worthwhile for me to share some of my story with you all. Over the last 9 months or so that we've been coming to this church, I've gotten to know quite a few of you, and I've shared some things about myself. A lot of you know that I like to hike, I'm going to school, I'm starting a new job. Some of you have even met my dog. But those are kind of the easier things for us to share, right? You've all welcomed us. We feel so welcome here. You welcomed us into membership, Sepa and I, last week. And so we've come to really love and trust this church family. So I'm going to trust you today with some of the parts of my story that are maybe less easy to share. The first time I heard John 20, I was in Sunday school. And I don't remember all the details, but I remember the takeaway very clearly. Doubting is bad. Questioning, also bad. The teacher asked each of us to put ourselves in Thomas's shoes, to really put ourselves into the story, and she asked us, would you have believed without proof? And of course, I was like, oh, yeah, of course. All of us, not a single person in the class was like, well, all of us were like, oh, absolutely, we are faithful children in this class. But even at that time, I knew that wasn't true. I was at that time, and I have always been a questioner of things. In my large conservative family, this was seen as rebellion or willfulness. Children, especially young women, were meant to obey and not question. Because of this, for much of my life, I thought that to question was to sin. As I grew up, I did my best to fall in line, even when that meant that I had to cut away the parts of myself that didn't align with what a Christian young woman was supposed to be. As a teen working at Christian camp and a young adult attending Christian college, I tried to shove down my questions and my doubts about God, about life and faith, and to bury my confusion about my sexuality, my place in God's kingdom. Soon after graduation, I met and began a relationship with a young man. We moved back to Alaska and we got married, and that relationship quickly turned very abusive. I don't really need to tell you all the details because you already know the story. It was a classic textbook example of domestic violence and spousal abuse. I was every statistic that you can think of that you say, that would never happen to me, but it did. This very troubled man would sometimes twist the word of God as a justification for the abuse that was happening. And I convinced myself that if I was the perfect Christian wife, then the abuse might stop. If I could just be a little better, a little softer, then maybe something would change. By some miracle, I found the strength to leave my marriage pretty quickly after it began. And at that time, in a rush of bravery or adrenaline, I came out to my friends and my family as gay. I was ostracized by my family, nearly every Christian that I know, and my church membership was revoked. I felt completely broken. And in some ways, maybe a lot of ways, I blamed not necessarily God, but Christianity. To my absolute terror, I began to lose my faith completely. Some of you may have heard the term deconstruction. It's a word that those who have left the faith often use to describe the process of dismantling all of their previous religious beliefs. Or in some online Christian circles, it's thought of more as a dangerous disease, the boogeyman stealing young people away from the church in the night. But many church people don't understand what it really looks like. How many of you have a junk drawer? Okay, yeah, we got some honest people here. You know the one with the Chinese takeout menus and the random hardware from furniture we don't even have anymore, dried up pens, ketchup packets that are definitely expired. Have you ever tried to tackle organizing it? Yeah? Deconstruction is like that. In order to organize it, you have to take out every piece of junk in there, piece by piece, until you have an empty drawer in a kitchen absolutely covered in nonsense. A real mess. You have to decide which things are important and which things no longer serve a purpose. And much like a faith journey, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Each item in the drawer represents a belief that you hold, biblical or not, true or, like Dave's recent series, half true. In therapy, they call these things core beliefs, and they're what make up the things that they shape our entire perception of reality. Even after a challenging childhood, domestic violence, divorce in my early 20s, coming out as gay in this town, and to my huge and conservative family, the idea of an empty drawer was the scariest thing that I could imagine. What if I make this huge mess and there's just nothing left? My drawer was nearly empty. At the lowest point of my deconstruction, I remember telling someone, I know there's a God, but that's about it. That's all I can say. And that's terrifying. If you've built your whole life around this image of being a Christian and you really put all your eggs in that basket and then maybe it's gone, like what do you do after that? Who am I? Many of us are familiar with the part of the gospel where Jesus tells us we should have faith like little children. Another classic Sunday school favorite. My whole life I was taught and believed that when he said that, he meant blind faith, no questions asked. How many of you have kids or grandkids? How many of those kids just blindly do what you say without asking any questions? Right? Not very many. It's amazing. Kids are so curious. We're all born with this natural curiosity. And if we're born with it, then I have to believe that's a gift from God, right? At what point in our growing up did we feel the need to replace our curiosity with certainty? When did we stop asking difficult, honest, truth-seeking questions and start reciting the answers? Certainty is alluring, and I know. What better way to stave off our doubt and our anxiety than to pretend we have all the answers? But false certainty is like a tree with no roots. The first gust of wind, the first real challenge, and it all comes toppling down. I can't speak for any of you, but I would challenge you to ask yourself these questions right now. Is your need for certainty holding you back from a true, flourishing, and honest relationship with God? There's only two more. Are there questions you've been harboring, hidden away, that you're too afraid to ask? Do you have doubts that are too scary to admit even to yourself? Pretty uncomfortable, right? I get it. But if the answers to any of these questions were yes, I urge you to bring it to God. Because when we face these incredibly uncomfortable realities, we're inviting him to meet us right where we are. When I read the story of doubting Thomas now, I do so with an entirely different perspective. We don't know why, but Thomas was not with the other disciples when Jesus first appeared to them. When they tell him about what happened, in verse 25, he replies, I won't believe unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hands into the wound at his side. Thomas isn't asking for anything more than the other disciples had already received. And yet he ends up with the bad rep, doubting Thomas. It's easy for us to use this story as a Sunday school lesson, warning children against unbelief. But I don't think that's what's happening here. Thomas is not opposing the truth. He's seeking the truth. And 8 days later, Jesus shows up to give him exactly what he needs. Verse 26, the disciples were together again. This time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. Peace be with you, he said. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. Look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound at my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. My Lord and my God, Thomas exclaimed. And then Jesus told him, you believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. Jesus is not rebuking Thomas. He's meeting him exactly where he's at, answering his exact questions without condemnation. When I reread this story, I think to myself, he didn't have to show up again, just for Thomas. If this is a story about condemnation, he would have just left him in the dark and let him live out the rest of his life unbelieving, but he didn't. He showed up in exactly the way Thomas needed him to show up. In the depths of my despair, in the middle of my very reluctant deconstruction, Jesus gave me exactly what I needed. In my desperation and my brokenness, I finally trusted him with my questions, with the most gritty and brutal and unsavory parts of myself that I had been scared to reveal, but of course he knew all along. He showed up. He provided this church family where I have felt and experienced Christ-like love and acceptance that I have never received before. He gave me his peace, which surpasses all understanding. He blessed me with incredible healing for past trauma and pain. Without hesitation or condemnation, he welcomed me back with the most radical and encircling love that I could have imagined. Friends, our God is so big. He can handle our questions, our deepest truths, and our most painful secrets. When Jesus said to Thomas, you believe because you have seen me, blessed are those who believe without seeing me, he's not shaming him for his lack of belief, but rather pointing out how blessed future Christians will be who will believe without ever having seen him in the flesh. And that's us. This is touched on again at the end of this chapter, and when I was rereading this chapter in preparation for today, it brought me to tears. The disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him you will have life by the power of his name.